Diane Wexford dropped the report in front of Ethan Cole and slid it across the table so the whole room could hear what came next. "Do as I say, or walk out that door." The pages in front of him were built to bury a defect that could put hundreds of drivers at risk on the highway. Ethan didn't argue and didn't raise his voice. He stood, walked back to his desk, pulled a cardboard box from the supply closet, and started clearing out everything that belonged to him. Everyone in the office assumed he had simply lost. Then the head of compliance burst in, pale and out of breath, asking who had just pushed out the only man with the authority to keep a $620 million contract alive. Ethan Cole showed up at Wexford Meridian Logistics before the executive floor had even switched its lights on, the way he had every weekday for the past 6 years. He walked the same corridor, past the same dark offices, badge in hand, coffee going cold, his mind already running through the checks he needed to finish before the building woke up. He pulled up the Guardian Grid dashboard, the safety monitoring system he'd built years earlier as an independent engineer, long before anyone at Wexford knew his name, and began combing through the fleet readings ahead of a major rollout. Several sensors on trucks slated for the new project were returning numbers that broke from their normal pattern, small mismatches most people would wave off without a second look. Ethan never waved anything off. He'd learned back in his days running a one-man safety software shop out of a rented workshop that a tiny inconsistency in a weight sensor or a braking curve was rarely tiny. It was usually just the first visible edge of something bigger hiding underneath. He pulled the historical baseline for each flagged truck and set it against the sudden drift that had shown up only in the past 2 weeks, right around when the Meridian Health rollout schedule had been locked in. The timing bothered him more than the numbers did, since gear that ran steady for months didn't usually slip out of calibration on its own without something pushing it. His phone buzzed once, a quick call from his daughter, Mia, asking if he'd make it home for dinner. He said he'd try, kept it short, and didn't let her hear the tension building in his voice. Mia had gotten used to nights her father came home later than promised, and she never complained, though Ethan always caught the quiet disappointment she tried to hide whenever a dinner plan fell through. He'd raised her mostly alone since she was small, and somewhere in there she'd picked up his habit of noticing the things everyone else overlooked. Down on the warehouse floor, the crew respected him because he still walked among them, checking loading docks and talking with drivers instead of disappearing behind a glass door. Drivers waved him over without a second thought whenever something felt wrong with a route or a load, trusting he'd actually look into it instead of filing it away. That trust took years to build, and it stood in sharp contrast to how the newer executives treated him every budget season. Leadership saw his caution as an old habit from a man too careful to keep up with a company trying to grow fast. Diane Wexford was getting ready to announce the deal that would define her time as CEO, a $620 million agreement with Meridian Health Network to move sensitive medical equipment across the country. The contract could save a stock price that had been sliding for 2 straight quarters and quiet board members who'd started questioning her leadership behind closed doors. Ethan found that Guardian Grid had logged 47 separate incidents involving inconsistent weight sensor and braking readings across the trucks lined up for the new route. If the rollout went forward on schedule, hundreds of vehicles would hit active service before anyone dealt with what was causing the errors. Diane had spent most of the past year personally courting Meridian Health's leadership, flying out to their headquarters more times than her own board could easily track. Set on landing the biggest contract Wexford Meridian had ever signed, she saw the deal as proof she belonged at the head of a company her family had built 2 generations before her, a way to silence the quiet doubts some board members still carried about a CEO who had inherited more than she'd built.
Every week the rollout slipped felt to her like another week closer to losing the people she needed most on her side. He pulled up the internal safety report meant for the executive review meeting and felt his stomach drop. The single most serious warning on the list had been quietly downgraded from red to yellow, as if someone had reached into the data and softened the danger before anyone with real authority ever saw it. Ethan found Derek Holt down at the dispatch center before the morning shift began, and the two of them pulled up the raw telemetry together, saying little at first. Derek confirmed what Ethan already suspected, that a test truck on a downhill route had nearly lost control days earlier, saved only by a driver quick enough to steer out of the skid before it turned into something worse. Derek had filed an incident note that same afternoon, expecting it to trigger an automatic review the way every near miss had in the past. Instead, the note just sat in a queue nobody above him seemed in any hurry to open. He told Ethan he'd figured it was an oversight, a busy week, nothing more sinister than a backlog. Standing there at the dispatch terminal, both men started to suspect it was something else entirely. The early data showed the fault had nothing to do with driver error and everything to do with software that had misread the truck's true weight on the descent. The driver, a longtime employee named Tom Bradley, had reported the near miss right away, describing the feeling of the trailer starting to slide before his training and instinct pulled the truck back under control. Ethan asked for a 3-day pause on the rollout so every sensor in the fleet could be checked before another truck left the yard. Bruce Callahan pushed back hard, arguing any delay would cost the company its early completion bonus and might give Meridian Health an opening to walk. Bruce had built his whole career on being the man who made the numbers work, the executive who could always find a way around a deadline no matter what got in the way. And a 3-day pause struck him as exactly the kind of caution that ends careers instead of protecting them. He reminded the room more than once that the bonus tied to early completion would fund a big chunk of his own pay for the year, though he framed his objection entirely around the company's interests rather than his own stake in it. Then he told the data team to reclassify the incident as a negligible variance, language that stripped every ounce of urgency from what Ethan had just watched happen with his own eyes.
Ethan refused to sign off on that language and instead filed a formal report directly to Diane, to Compliance Officer Nora Bennett, and to the Internal Audit Division. Nora warned the whole executive floor that any change to a safety record needed Ethan's direct signature, since his role as lead systems engineer made him the only person authorized to approve that kind of edit. Diane never answered the report itself. Instead, she called an emergency meeting with her senior directors, and behind closed doors, Bruce told her privately that Ethan was just trying to prove he mattered more than the woman running the company. He suggested, carefully and without saying it outright, that a technical manager who challenges a CEO in writing is building a case for himself, not protecting anyone on the road. That conversation settled it in Diane's mind, and she walked into the meeting already planning to make an example of him in front of everyone. She'd faced enough quiet pushback from longtime staff since taking over that she'd started treating any hesitation as a test of her authority rather than a real concern worth looking into. When Ethan got to the conference room, he found copies of his own report waiting on the table, quietly rewritten, missing nothing but a signature line at the bottom. Diane opened the meeting in front of more than 20 senior managers, with several more joining by video from other regional offices. She called Ethan out publicly, accusing him of letting technical nerves get in the way of sound business strategy, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone used to being agreed with. She reminded the room that the Meridian Health Agreement was the biggest single contract in company history, a deal that would secure jobs and stability for everyone at that table, and she framed any delay as a threat to all of it, rather than routine caution. Several directors nodded along, more out of habit than real conviction, none of them willing to be the first to question a CEO who just tied the company's whole future to one deal. Ethan didn't flinch at the insult and didn't raise his voice either. He simply laid out, plainly, that the fleet data wasn't reliable enough yet to certify the trucks safe for a nationwide medical transport contract. Bruce cut in, saying the odds of another incident were statistically low and that the real threat to the company was the financial hit from an unnecessary delay. He cited numbers from his own team's projections, figures built on confidence intervals and best-case assumptions that conveniently left out the one incident everyone in the room already knew had happened. Nobody challenged his math out loud, though a few engineers along the back wall traded looks that made clear they understood exactly what was being left unsaid. Into the silence that followed, Ethan asked a direct question: who had changed the warning level in the safety system before the meeting even started? Nobody answered. Diane dodged the question entirely and slid the revised report closer to him, waiting for him to pick up a pen. Ethan told her calmly that he could sign a statement confirming the fleet wasn't ready, but he wouldn't put his name on language that misrepresented what the sensors had actually reported. Diane felt her authority challenged in real time, in front of every director she needed to keep in line, and something in her posture hardened. She hadn't expected a quiet systems manager to hold his ground this firmly in front of an audience that size, and the longer the silence stretched, the more it felt like a contest she couldn't afford to lose. She glanced at Bruce, who gave the faintest nod of encouragement, then turned back to Ethan and said the words slowly enough for the whole room to absorb them, each syllable landing like she believed she was settling the matter for good. "Do as I say, or walk that door." Ethan asked her to confirm out loud that she was ordering him to ignore a documented safety warning. She repeated the ultimatum without hesitation, unaware that the video conferencing system had been quietly generating a written transcript of the entire exchange as it happened. Several people in the room seemed to be waiting for Ethan to apologize, to walk it back, to find some quiet middle ground the way employees usually do when a CEO draws a hard line. Instead, he closed the folder in front of him, stood up without hurrying, and said only that he understood the choice he'd been given. He walked to a supply closet down the hall and carried a plain cardboard box back to his desk. Word of what happened moved across the technical floor faster than any company memo could, and several engineers found reasons to avoid eye contact as he passed, worried that being seen near him might draw Diane's attention their way. A few stopped by his desk anyway, offering quiet words of support in hallway voices, careful not to be overheard by anyone heading for the elevators. One young engineer, barely 2 years into her career, told him she'd learned more about doing the job honestly from watching him than from anything in her formal training. Ethan thanked her but didn't linger, knowing that dwelling on it would only make the walk to the parking garage harder. Derek wanted him to stay and fight it out from the inside, arguing someone needed to keep pushing back against the pressure from the executive floor. Ethan told him staying and signing a falsified report would be the real surrender, not walking away from it. He packed only what belonged to him: an old coffee mug, a worn notebook full of handwritten diagrams, a photo of Mia from years back, and a small toy truck she'd given him for a birthday. Each item came off the shelf slowly, without any drama, the same unhurried pace he'd brought to everything he'd ever done in that building. Part of him still expected someone from the executive floor to come down and ask him to reconsider. No one did,
and the silence told him something about how quickly people were ready to move once a decision had already been made. He didn't copy a single company file, didn't lock anyone out of the systems he'd built, and didn't damage a thing on his way out. Before leaving, he filed his resignation through the official compliance channel instead of just walking out the door. In it, he cited a clause from the original licensing agreement covering Guardian Grid, a platform he'd designed and licensed to Wexford Meridian years before ever becoming an employee. An automated notice went out within minutes to Nora, to the full board, to the company's insurance carrier, and to Meridian Health Network itself. The safety platform kept running exactly as before, but its certification status quietly shifted to a new designation, pending assigned technical authority. Diane stepped out of the conference room just as Ethan lifted the box off his desk, and she told him almost casually that the company would have someone in his chair by the end of the day. He said nothing back. He put on his jacket, picked up the box, and walked out the same doors he'd come through every morning for 6 years.
That was the moment Nora came rushing across the floor, asking Diane point blank whether she had actually just forced Ethan Cole into resigning. Diane answered that he was just a technical employee, replaceable like anyone else on the org chart. Nora pulled up the original licensing contract on her tablet and told her, in front of several other directors, that Ethan had been formally designated as the responsible engineer for the entire first phase of the Meridian Health rollout. She reminded Diane that she herself had signed off on that provision months earlier, during the final round of negotiations, a detail Diane seemed to have genuinely forgotten in the rush of closing what she considered the deal of her career. As the words left Nora's mouth, the big monitor in the executive corridor updated automatically with a notice that stopped the whole floor cold. The Meridian Health contract, valued at $620 million, had just been placed on hold pending review. The office fell into an uneasy quiet as Diane began to understand that Ethan's departure wasn't something she could undo with a simple personnel decision. Nora explained that his resignation hadn't killed the contract outright, but it had triggered a mandatory pause so Meridian Health could confirm exactly why their designated engineer had left so abruptly. She reminded the room that Meridian Health's own procurement team had insisted on the responsible engineer clause during negotiations, specifically because moving sensitive medical equipment across the country carried liabilities that couldn't be waved away by a personnel change. A Meridian Health rep had already called twice that morning, asking pointed questions nobody in the room felt ready to answer honestly. The insurance carrier followed within the hour, demanding every safety record from the past 30 days before it would keep the policy active. Walter Sterling, chairman of the board, called an emergency session the moment he heard what happened, unwilling to let it sit overnight. He'd sat on that board for nearly 2 decades, long enough to remember when the company still ran under Diane's father, and he took his duty to shareholders seriously, even when it meant asking uncomfortable questions of whoever currently ran the place. He showed up still wearing the clothes he'd put on that morning for a completely different meeting, not willing to waste the time it would take to change. Before he could even address what he considered a real crisis, Diane told him Ethan was using his old patent leverage to hold the company hostage out of resentment. Bruce suggested drafting a formal legal threat, arguing Ethan's resignation had caused direct financial harm to the company and its shareholders. Nora pushed back, reminding both of them that the internal record showed Ethan had filed repeated warnings well before he ever turned in his resignation, each one time-stamped and routed through the proper compliance channel, exactly as policy required.
She warned that going after a former employee who'd followed every rule on his way out would only draw more attention to the warnings the company was trying to bury. Walter listened to both sides without picking one, though the tightness in his face suggested he was already starting to doubt the story he'd been handed that morning. Ethan left the building without looking back, though a few employees gathered near the lobby windows to watch him walk to his truck. On the drive home, his phone rang non-stop with calls from reporters and even a couple of competitors, none of which he picked up. He felt no satisfaction watching the project grind to a halt, worrying instead about the thousands of ordinary employees who could lose their livelihoods if the company's finances collapsed under a canceled contract. He thought about Derek, about the young engineer who'd thanked him on his way out, about drivers he'd known by name for years who had nothing to do with any decision made in a conference room. None of them deserved to lose their livelihoods over choices they never had a hand in.
That thought sat heavier on him that evening than anything Diane had said earlier. That night, he sent a supplemental notice granting Guardian Meridian continued use of Guardian Grid over the next 30 days, giving them room to stabilize without shutting down entirely. The gesture made clear his intention had never been revenge, only protecting the drivers and workers who had nothing to do with decisions made above them. Walter began quietly wondering whether the story Diane had told him about a disgruntled ex-employee was really the whole picture. When Nora finished reviewing the audit trail that night, she found Bruce Callahan's name attached to all 47 downgraded warnings. Diane ordered Ethan's system access revoked immediately and demanded a full search of his work computer, convinced her security team would find evidence of sabotage if they looked hard enough. The technology division confirmed instead that Ethan had deleted nothing, copied nothing, and left every system exactly as he found it, a fact that quietly frustrated Diane more than she'd admit out loud. She'd expected to find something to point to, some act of retaliation that would justify the version of events she was already feeding the board. The audit came back clean across the board. That didn't slow her down. If anything, it pushed her toward pressuring the people still inside the building, the ones with paychecks and mortgages riding on whether they kept their jobs through the coming weeks. Bruce shifted tactics, pressuring junior engineers to sign statements claiming Ethan had manufactured warnings that were never truly necessary. Some, afraid of losing their jobs, stayed quiet rather than push back against a directive from the CFO. Derek refused outright to put his name on anything like that, and Diane suspended him the same afternoon as a warning to anyone else considering the same defiance. He cleared his desk without complaint, telling a colleague on the way out that he'd rather lose a paycheck than lie about something that had nearly gotten a driver killed. The suspension rattled the rest of the operations team more than Diane expected, and productivity on the dispatch floor slowed noticeably in the days that followed, though nobody dared say why out loud. The technical division tried installing a replacement engineer in Ethan's old role, only to have Meridian Health reject the substitution because the new hire had no history with the Guardian Grid platform. A week passed with the fleet still running under the 30-day grace period Ethan had granted, pressure inside the company building as Meridian Health's questions grew sharper by the day. Diane called Ethan directly a few days later, offering him a week to come back, sign the outstanding paperwork, and then resign on friendlier terms afterward. He declined, telling her plainly that the underlying sensor failure still hadn't been fixed and nothing about fleet safety had changed. Bruce sent him a private settlement offer with a hefty payout attached, on the condition Ethan publicly describe his departure as a personal decision unrelated to company conduct.
The offer came wrapped in careful language about mutual understanding and moving forward gracefully, though its real intent was plain to anyone who read past the first paragraph.
Ethan read it twice at his kitchen table that night, turning a pen over his hand for a long moment before deciding what to do with it. He forwarded the offer immediately to Nora and to an independent attorney retained by the board, refusing to let the attempt disappear quietly. At home that week, Mia appeared only briefly, noticing the cardboard box by the front door, but never asking about money or headlines. She simply asked her father if he'd done the right thing, and he told her that doing the right thing never came with a guarantee it would be easy. She smiled the way she always did when he said something she'd clearly remember for a long time, and told him she was proud of him without needing to explain why. That same night, Derek sent Ethan a legally obtained copy of an email he'd received months earlier through normal channels. It revealed that Bruce hadn't acted alone in burying the warnings. Diane herself had written the instruction that started it all: lower the risk rating before the board sees it, sent under her own name weeks before the confrontation in the conference room ever happened. Ethan agreed to meet with the independent investigators the board appointed once the scale of the situation became clear, arriving at their temporary offices with a folder of his own records rather than an attorney at his side. The lead investigator, a former transportation safety official with decades of experience reviewing exactly this kind of failure, told him afterward she'd rarely seen a witness so unconcerned with his own vindication. He asked for no financial settlement and made no demand that Diane be removed outright, a restraint that surprised even Nora, who'd expected him to push harder after everything he'd been through. His only request, that the rollout stay paused until every one of the 47 flagged warnings had been properly reviewed and resolved. He walked the investigators through the full history of Guardian Grid's development, the terms of the original licensing agreement, and every warning he'd personally filed in the months before he resigned. The timestamps on his reports proved they'd been created well before the contract was ever suspended, closing off any argument that he'd manufactured a crisis out of spite after losing his job. Investigators cross-referenced every filing against the compliance system's own internal logs and confirmed nothing had been altered or backdated, a level of diligence Ethan had expected and quietly welcomed. Nora supplied the recorded transcript from the conference room, capturing the exact moment Diane ordered him to sign a document she knew misrepresented the fleet's condition. Bruce tried reaching Ethan privately one more time, promising to help him launch a new company if he'd agree to accept sole responsibility for the sensor failures himself. Ethan documented that conversation carefully, following his attorney's exact guidance, then handed the recording over to the investigators without hesitation. Bruce's tone on that recording had shifted from persuasive to something closer to desperate by the end, a detail the investigators noted with particular interest.
Derek and 3 other engineers agreed to testify about how the warning data had been altered before it reached senior leadership, each describing the same pattern of pressure applied through informal channels rather than official directives that could easily be traced. Their accounts lined up closely enough, without any coordination between them, that investigators considered the pattern effectively confirmed within the first week of interviews. Walter finally understood that Diane and Bruce hadn't simply taken a risky shortcut. They had actively misled the board that was supposed to be overseeing them. He spent a long evening reviewing the timeline himself, comparing dates and signatures until the pattern became impossible to explain away as anything but deliberate concealment. It troubled him deeply that he'd trusted the summaries handed to him at quarterly meetings without ever asking to see the data underneath, a lesson he resolved never to repeat however the current crisis played out. Diane still held her title as CEO, and she began preparing one last strategy to protect what remained of her position. She planned to argue in front of the full board that Ethan had designed Guardian Grid specifically to make the company permanently dependent on him. The board demanded he appear in person at an emergency session to answer that accusation directly. Diane believed the hearing would be the moment his reputation finally collapsed in front of everyone who mattered. Instead, Ethan walked into that room carrying a simulation the board had never seen before. Diane opened the session by describing him as a bitter former employee trying to seize control of the company during a moment of crisis. Ethan didn't respond to the personal attack and instead asked for 10 minutes to present data directly to the board, his tone even enough that a few directors seemed unsettled by how little emotion he showed after everything said about him publicly. Walter granted the request, glancing at Diane as if to remind her the floor no longer belonged exclusively to the CEO in a hearing this serious. He ran 2 simulations side by side on the main screen. The first, using the original, unaltered sensor data, automatically flagged all 47 high-risk vehicles for removal from active service. The second, using the modified figures Bruce's team had approved, let every truck keep running without restriction on a familiar downhill route. The altered simulation consistently miscalculated both vehicle weight and required stopping distance, the exact failure that had nearly caused a serious accident weeks earlier. Several directors leaned forward as the 2 outcomes played out side by side, the gap between them impossible to explain away as an honest rounding error or a minor quirk. One board member asked quietly how long the company had been operating on the altered figures without anyone outside a small circle knowing. Ethan explained calmly that he'd never engineered any dependency on himself. The requirement for a designated responsible engineer had come directly from Meridian Health's own contract terms, months before he ever considered leaving. Nora confirmed that Diane personally had been briefed on that exact clause 3 months earlier, well before any of this began. Walter turned to Diane and asked why she had issued an ultimatum to the one employee explicitly tasked with protecting fleet safety. She tried to shift blame onto Bruce, insisting she'd simply trusted Bruce's financial analysis without looking closely at the engineering data underneath it. Nora presented the email that proved otherwise, the same message in which Diane had personally instructed her team to lower the risk rating before the board could review it.
Bruce tried to leave the room as the tension rose, gathering his papers as if the meeting had already ended. But he was told to stay until the investigation's findings had been formally entered into the record. His composure, so carefully held through years of investor calls and quarterly presentations, finally cracked as he realized the board had no appetite left for the explanations he'd relied on for months. The board voted to suspend both Diane and Bruce immediately, forwarding the full body of evidence to the appropriate regulators for further review. The vote took only a few minutes, a stark contrast to how long Diane had spent building the version of events she believed would protect her that morning. Bruce stared at the table, saying nothing further, while Diane's expression shifted from disbelief to something closer to resignation as the final tally was read aloud. No one in the room celebrated. The scale of the deception left everyone quiet, sitting with how close the company had come to disaster. Close enough that a single skid on a wet downhill grade could have ended in headlines none of them would have wanted their names attached to. Walter turned to Ethan and admitted, in front of the entire board, that they had badly misjudged him as someone easily replaced. He offered Ethan the position of interim CEO on the spot, expecting it to be an easy decision for a man who'd just been proven right in front of everyone. Ethan declined, explaining he had no interest in claiming victory by simply taking the chair Diane had once sat in. Instead, he laid out 5 conditions the board would need to accept if he was going to keep supporting the company's recovery. Derek and every other employee suspended for refusing to falsify records would be immediately reinstated with full back pay and no mark on their record. A new independent safety division would be created, reporting directly to the board instead of sitting under the finance office. Drivers and engineers would be given explicit protection to pause operations over safety concerns without fear of retaliation from leadership. The full findings of the investigation would be shared openly with employees and with Meridian Health, rather than quietly filed away. And no frontline worker would be laid off to offset financial damage caused entirely by decisions made above their pay grade. Walter read the list twice before setting it down, telling Ethan quietly that most executives in his position would have asked for far more than 5 conditions, built almost entirely around protecting other people. Ethan replied he'd never wanted the company to owe him anything personally, only to owe its employees and customers the honesty it had failed to give them for months. Ethan agreed to stay as an independent advisor while the company worked through repairing its fleet and its culture, making clear from the start that the arrangement was temporary, not a permanent return to the org chart. He spent long hours over the following weeks walking the new safety division through every flaw he'd cataloged, patient even with questions from engineers who'd once avoided his desk out of caution. He restructured the Guardian Grid licensing agreement so it no longer depended on any single person, placing oversight instead under a newly formed technical review board, proof his goal had never been to make the company permanently dependent on him. Meridian Health agreed to resume the contract once the fleet passed a fully independent safety certification, sending its own engineers to observe the testing firsthand rather than relying solely on Wexford Meridian's internal assurances the way it had at the start of the relationship. The total value of the agreement stayed the same, though the implementation timeline was extended to allow proper testing across every vehicle. The board accepted every one of Ethan's conditions without objection, a decision that would have seemed unthinkable to most of them only weeks earlier. For the first time in its history, Wexford Meridian Logistics found itself operating under a set of principles written by the very man its CEO had once told to quit.
6 months later, the Guardian Grid platform had been fully repaired and deployed safely across the entire fleet with no further incidents on any route. The Meridian Health contract moved forward as planned, though it was no longer treated internally as a prize to be leveraged for executive bonuses without oversight. Diane left the company following the board's investigation, facing significant financial and professional consequences without any confrontation beyond the paperwork and public record. Bruce's employment was terminated outright, and he remained under continued scrutiny for his role in altering the original safety data.
Derek was promoted to Director of Safety Operations, a role created specifically because of what he refused to sign months earlier. Nora took charge of the company's newly formed Independent Compliance Committee, reporting directly to the board rather than to any single executive. Under her direction, the committee published a quarterly safety summary available to every employee, a level of transparency the company had never practiced before the crisis forced the change. Morale on the operations floor improved noticeably once drivers understood that raising a concern would no longer put their job at risk, and reported incidents actually increased in the months that followed, a shift the new leadership treated as a sign of trust returning, not a problem to hide. Ethan founded a small firm called Coal Integrity Systems, focused on auditing transportation safety platforms for companies that couldn't afford to repeat Wexford Meridian's mistakes. His former employer became his very first client, though the relationship now looked nothing like the one he'd walked away from months earlier. Coal Integrity Systems grew slowly, one careful contract at a time, and Ethan turned away more business than he accepted, unwilling to work with any company unwilling to act on what his audits found. Derek occasionally called him just to talk through a technical question, and Nora's compliance committee sent him a standing invitation to review their quarterly reports, an arrangement built on mutual respect rather than any contract. He still drove the same old pickup truck to work every morning, and the cardboard box he'd once carried out of that office sat quietly on a shelf in his new workspace, untouched but never thrown away. Mia stopped by once more near the end of it all, setting the small toy truck she'd given him years earlier on the corner of his new desk. She asked whether he'd ever regretted quitting his job the day everything changed. Ethan told her he'd never actually quit. He'd simply refused to become the kind of person that job was trying to turn him into. She smiled at that, the way she always did whenever her father said something she'd clearly remember, and told him she was proud of him without needing an explanation. The story closes back inside the halls of Wexford Meridian Logistics, where a new sign now hangs in the executive conference room for every future leader to see before taking a seat at that table. No deadline, contract, or title outranks safety and the truth. Somewhere in the industry, other executives had begun quietly citing what happened at Wexford Meridian as a cautionary tale, a reminder that pressuring an engineer to sign away a warning rarely stays contained inside a single conference room. Diane once believed her ultimatum would bring a quiet engineer to his knees in front of the people he worked with every day. Instead, when the single father lifted that cardboard box and walked calmly out of the room, she learned too late that she hadn't simply dismissed an employee. She had lost the one person still brave enough to save the company from the very people running it.